I go into my doctor's office and explain to my doctor, hey, I was working up on a tower. I think I got overexposed to some RF. And my doctor's sitting there listening, like, okay, nodding his head. He closes the door to the room and he looks at me and says, look, man, you're a tool and I'm a tool. He said, there's no way you can prove this and there's nothing else I can do for you.
The Harvard Center for Ethics actually put out a report, and it was called Captured Agency. And they compared the tactics of the wireless industry to big tobacco. There's a revolving door between industry and government.
OSHA has no authority over the licensees. OSHA only has authority over employers.
So many years ago, I showed up to a tower site and met with a technician on the ground, and we came up with a plan of what work needed to be done on top of the tower. And generally, a tower is broken down into 3 sectors. It's a triangle. You'll drop or power down one sector of antennas at a time. So I got into position up on top of the tower, made a radio call to the base, to the technician, to have alpha sector powered down. So I got out and started working in front of these antennas. Within about 30 minutes, I started feeling uncomfortable, kind of warm, and this was a couple years into my career as a climber at the time. I didn't really know all of the effects, but I knew it kind of made you hot. I didn't really get into too many situations up until that point where I had any more effects than the heating. So I get these cables replaced that I was working on, and I get back on the tower, call down to the technician and say, okay, you can power alpha sector back up. Let's now power down beta sector. So I go down, climb underneath, hang underneath the antennas, essentially in front of them where I'm replacing these cables. And similar thing, I'm working and just not feeling good, right? And I did this for the final sector, gamma sector. We get everything powered back up and I climb down the tower. And the technician working at the base of the tower proceeds to tell me, hey man, I kept calling in to have the antennas powered down and they kept turning them back on. And he didn't think it was a good idea to let me know. But at this point, I'm not feeling good. Just very scrambled thoughts. My brain just did not feel right. So the guy I was working with, I just told him, I said, hey man, you're going to have to drive home. I don't feel right. So I hopped in the passenger seat. We drove the 3 hours home. And that night, I called my company and told them what had happened and said, I'm not sure what's going on. My vision just doesn't seem right. My thoughts are just kind of fumbled and my brain just doesn't feel right, And my company immediately said, hey, don't go to the doctor. Don't tell anybody about this. We'll pay you for the week. Just take the week off. You'll be fine and you'll recover from it. The next day, I just was feeling off. So I called my doctor and said, hey, I want to get checked out. Had an incident at work. Didn't really explain too much about what had happened. And I go into my doctor's office and explain to my doctor, I was working up on a tower. I think I got overexposed to some RF. And my doctor's sitting there listening, like, okay, nodding his head. And he closes the door to the room. And he looks at me and says, look, man, you're a tool and I'm a tool. He said, there's no way you can prove this and there's nothing else I can do for you. Literally his exact words. So I just left his office. I went back home and just figured, okay, if the doctor doesn't see a problem with this, it must not be that big of a deal. And I'll probably recover like everybody else is telling me. But I was consistently put back in these situations where I'm out in the field getting exposed to RF.
Symptoms of overexposure that can happen for cell tower climbers, or if you're on a rooftop or really in close proximity to antennas, are a feeling of warmth, because radio frequency radiation can cause heat at very high levels. There can be a feeling of sickness, headaches, tiredness, lethargy that comes on. A metallic taste in your mouth is what has been described by people when they are really close to antennas. So my name is Theodora Scarato, and I am Director of the Wireless and Electromagnetic Fields Program at Environmental Health Sciences. I'm also a special expert to the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. I've been working on the issue of the policy issues related to RF exposure for over a decade. So RF is radio frequency radiation, which is a type of non-ionizing radiation. Not ionizing, which is like X-rays, nuclear bombs, atomic energy, where you have ionization, where the electron is knocked out of the atom, and that's understood to directly damage DNA. Non-ionizing is a lower energy. However, there are biological effects. It is well understood that overheating from RF exposure can cause harm. That's how our limits are set. And then there's also lower level effects that are still being researched where safety is not as assured, according to many scientists who I work with. This is a case report done on a climber who had been exposed for over 2 hours to a transmitting antenna. He was not aware that it had been turned on, and he got burns. And when he went to get treatment, they did an MRI and they did not find anything. A few years later, I think about 6 years later, he went back. He'd had numbness in his hand and arm, and they did another MRI and they found lesions in his brain. The doctors that wrote that case report say that what this case is documenting is that extreme RF exposure can cause severe delayed neurological damage that mimics MS years after that initial exposure. Just because there's not publications doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I mean, I guess the question that I would ask is, how many times have you felt warm when you're by antennas? And is everyone wearing monitors? How does it change over time? Because sometimes you can have a level and there can be spikes that happen depending on what's going on or what time of the day. You know, you could be on a tower for hours. It's really important to know what is the exposure and then how can it be mitigated best. There's not requirements that exist, at least at the federal regulatory level, that there be monitoring every time you're doing tower climbing. We should really be gathering that information so that there can be evidence-based policies about, here's what an average exposure is like, here's what an exposure is like for this kind of facility. I mean, we need to know all of that in order to know how to have safety policies that really make sense.
Industry constantly pushes responsibility onto the climber. Identify the hazards yourself. Well, when some of these sites are so complex, it's not possible. Most of the time, tower climbers receive a basic awareness class on RF, which isn't nearly enough in my opinion. You'll find yourself frequently in situations working in tower farms or co-located sites where you might be working on one tower and there's another tower just directly across from you with antennas pointing directly at you. And it's not common practice within the industry to have that equipment turned off. With this basic RF training, they're telling you, stay back 10 feet from an antenna. Well, when all these antennas are different, what do you mean? What antenna? I'm a cell tower climber. I'm working around cell antennas. Okay, but I have a microwave dish pointed at me. There's just too many variables here. And again, all this responsibility is put on the climber to identify these hazards. And if something goes wrong, whose fault is it? It's the climber's fault, because we gave you training and you're going against your training. But the reality is that training is a joke. Another major problem is even when you power equipment down, that equipment can be remotely turned back on by Network Operations Center. And by the time I became a foreman, this had happened to me so many times, I just shut the breakers off when I had guys up on the tower working. I just didn't chance it because it was so common. This remote activation that often occurs is a well-known hazard within the industry. And there's one state that doesn't allow this, California. But every other state currently, this is going on. These issues, combined with a lack of training and so many variables on site, just set these climbers up for failure, 100%. To better understand why climbers are being overexposed to RF, I spoke with Bob Curtis. He served with the Department of Labor and OSHA for 27 years as their recognized national expert on non-ionizing radiation, the government's top authority on RF safety. Bob, thank you for joining me. For my viewers, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your responsibilities and role with OSHA?
My name is Bob Curtis. My job as a specialty for the Department of Labor, OSHA, was as its recognized national expert in non-ionizing radiation, including RF radiation. So certainly, if an issue came up where a tower climber, a worker on a rooftop had a concern about RF energy, excessive exposures, then those cases came to me. My position for tower climbers was to determine if they were being overexposed, and if so, would implement citation and require an RF safety program at that tower. I also represented the agency in developing exposure limits and compliance policy.
A lot of the time, tower climbers are working on equipment where you might be working behind that antenna on the lines behind that antenna, and you have those lines disconnected, and you called into the NOC to have that sector turned down, and that sector was remotely turned back on. That's a big problem we as tower climbers face in the industry for sure.
The biggest problem in terms of overexposures that we've come across is exactly the situation you're talking about. A worker, he's in front of antennas, he's working there, whether he's working strictly on the antenna, maybe he's just painting the tower or fixing the roof. He or she thinks they're safe, the power's been turned off, and then some operator comes in, swing shift, sees that the power's down, and they'll turn on the antenna. And we've had workers who are in the array of a FM antenna, all of a sudden the power had been turned back on. And so sure enough, they were overexposed and hospitalized very quickly after that. The standard for lockout tagout is it's on energy hazards. And if you can be overexposed to, in this case, RF energy, yes, that standard applies to you. And so you have to figure out how to make sure, just like you do if you were electric wiring in the house, in a building, you have a breaker box and you can lock that out. And so that when you're working on the wiring, somebody doesn't come and turn on the power. You can do the same thing. It's a very simple thing people are familiar with, and electricians are very familiar with it, and it's something that power climbers ought to be familiar with too.
As we spoke about earlier, this issue with antennas being remotely powered back on, I recall the other day speaking with you, and you had mentioned one state in the entire U.S. currently, they don't allow that, right? You said California, was it?
Yes, and California has it, and it's because they have a strong union representing the utility workers. It gives them the capability. They have a switch near the antenna, and so they can break the power right there at the antenna so that it cannot be turned on remotely. Powering it down, whatever way you use to make sure it's locked out when people are in the hazardous area, that's what you have to do under the law.
How much are they being exposed? How long are they being exposed? What's their total amount that they're being exposed to, not just at any one time or climb, but also over the course of their career? Because there are cumulative effects that are being documented. Now, the way our regulations are, they would say, well, there's no cumulative effects. There are many scientists who disagree with that. I mean, why wouldn't there be cumulative effects? But that needs to be evidence-based. And right now, there has not been any U.S. government agency or agencies that together have looked at all of the science on this issue in any recent years. And that's what our lawsuit was about. We filed against the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, because they said that they can keep their regulations from 1996. We said that, and we argued, that they have not looked at all of the science in order to make such a decision, because they're not health and safety experts at the FCC. They defer to other agencies. But other agencies are not looking at all of the science on this issue. And we won. In 2021, the U.S. Appeals Court D.C. Circuit determined that the FCC needed to respond and explain why it is keeping these 1996 regulations about how much radiation we're allowed to be exposed to, and they have to show that they've looked at all of the science, so that it has been looked at, and they haven't responded. It's been 4 years. Now, if they're so sure that the regulations we have are adequate, why couldn't they just have said, oh, here, let me explain it to you? There hasn't been a response from the FCC. You know, every year the science should be looked at, the regulations should be looked at. Scientists should say, you know, are these adequate in light of what we know? Do these regulations make sense?
I'm not saying that people don't have antennas powered down, because they do. And I'm also not sitting here saying that people are forced into these situations, but you're kind of like expected to do it. Like it's just part of the job, right? And I know there's a lot of people that are going to watch this video and say, hey, you're an idiot. Why are you working in front of live antennas? Well, let me tell you, it's very common, okay? It's very, very common in this industry for people to be doing that. And generally speaking, most people don't take this RF thing very serious. You know, some people have RF meters, but it's not a serious thing that most people are like making a big deal about.
The fields are extremely dangerous if you get above the standard. We set the standard not based on the common health effects that workers think about in terms of, my face got warm up or my ankles got heated up. By the time you've got those kind of health effects, you are well above the standard. The standard is based on cognitive health effects, the ability for you to think. That's not something you're going to feel. You mentioned you got too close to an omni antenna, and that you could feel heat from it, whatever. That means you're well above the standard, because again, the standard's based on a cognitive effect. That you can't think as well, or you can't learn things as well. It's all based on animal studies, but we don't know why it happens to even the animals. That's what the standard's based on, and it occurs well below where you might feel an effect. There's a big difference between if it's a tower with cellular antennas on versus a tower with FM radio and TV broadcast, or even AM towers. Those are located much higher, and they can climb the tower, maybe 70-80% of the tower until they get to the bottom bays of the FM antennas. And from there forward, climbing up higher, they will be overexposed if the antenna is not turned off or powered way down. You get a worker who says, I climbed the tower to change the light bulb up at the top. And I'll ask him, well, do you make sure that they turn off the power when you go up there? So, no, we transmit 24 hours a day. We never go off. Well, I know that worker has been overexposed. If the worker is working with cellular antennas, as long as they are not, within sometimes 6-10 feet the face of the cellular antenna, they won't be overexposed. They are being overexposed if they allow themselves to climb in front of the face of the antenna. Especially now with the 5G, there's a lot more power coming from there. There's no exposure problem behind the antenna. I'm an electrical engineer, and a lot of the engineers, especially the old timers, they feel like there's not a problem. Some of them will complain, well, I get a bad taste in my mouth, or my ankles get hot, because that's where the power goes from your body down to the ladder, for example. And so they are taking risks. They don't even realize it, because they're thinking, it's not so bad. It goes away, and they won't know that they have that health effect. And maybe it doesn't happen that they would recognize it for years and years. Or maybe tomorrow they realize that, hey, I can't remember phone numbers like I used to be able to. Whether the health effects occur or not, all of the licensees, they've all agreed they will not expose people above the exposure limits. So whenever a worker allows themselves to get to the point where they're feeling heat or whatever, they are taking a risk they absolutely should not be doing. It's not fair to the rest of the workers. It's not fair to their family. They should enforce it themselves. They should never take that kind of a risk.
In 2015, there was a request for information by OSHA about communication tower safety. They have a bunch of issues related to cell tower construction and falls and accidents and so forth. But they also had questions on RF exposure, and I want to read to you what they are. Is there a need for standardized industry-wide training or certification program? On radio frequency hazards, they say, much research has been done on the health effects of overexposure to RF. General health effects reviews have found that high levels of exposure will result in burns. In addition, the link between exposure to RF and cancer, reproductive diseases, and neurological effects has not been thoroughly explored. What methods are employers using to protect workers from overexposure to RF? Is there a need for employers to institute comprehensive RF monitoring programs on communication tower work sites? And what would a good program look like? This is really important. For asbestos or for chemicals, they have a framework, they have requirements, they have procedures and policies. How is this being monitored? What government agency is responsible for ensuring safety for climbers and for categorizing, keeping track of exposures like this? I mean, are they even being tracked? Like when you feel that you are overheated in a situation in climbing, Is that even being reported? Is there any kind of medical surveillance? I don't think so. And that really needs to be done, just like it is in other occupations, because this is a high exposure occupation. The processes and procedures that are used, while you'll see a lot of white papers, the US government hasn't come out with processes and procedures that are up to date. And there's no requirements that there be testing. There's no standardization of how they do the reporting. There's just a whole bunch of accountability, oversight, and enforcement issues that need to be dealt with. It's not really talked about. There aren't experts in US agencies on the issue. So OSHA might investigate, right, if they get a call or if you call to report, but that doesn't happen as often as overexposure might happen. And I'm sure that people don't want to report because they might be retaliated against if they do. And that's always an issue to be concerned about. So that's another place where there needs to be medical surveillance, where people are tracking the health of workers, finding out how much are you being exposed to, and then also looking at their health over time. But that is not being done. The way the limits are, it says, so long as you don't heat up to a certain degree, to a certain threshold, then you can have that same exposure forever. Most people are not experiencing heating from wireless technologies, but it's the people who are really close to those antennas that are feeling that. And that really deserves a lot more research and respect. I think it's outrageous that the US has limits based on decades-old science, and that they really need to modernize the limits. However, they don't acknowledge that cumulative effects exist. There is a large, substantial body of evidence that indicates cumulative exposure can impact your biology. That was actually one of the issues in our lawsuit. The FCC was ordered to respond on 6 things, and one of them was long-term exposure, because we had studies showing impacts from long-term exposure and how the regulations make sense in today's day and age, because those regulations were in 1996 for human exposure to RF. Everything's changed since 1996. I mean, we didn't even have smartphones in 1996. But that's how the limits were set at that time. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was a series of studies that were done. They were like, okay, we need to find out at what level of heat, causes harm. And they actually exposed small animals, small monkeys, and rats and mice to microwave frequencies for under an hour at very high levels. And then the level at which the animals stopped pressing a lever for food, they'd been starved, so normally in these experiments they would press the lever when they wanted to eat. They stopped doing that when they were heated to a certain degree. The scientists that I work with and the organizations I work with really question that and say we really need to take a look at that issue. Yes, heating obviously causes harm.
We wrote a new industry standard, C95.7, that describes what an RF safety program should include. And it has an example there of a very complex tower with FM and cellular, TV. It's actually a real life tower that I climbed many years ago. And it shows what information you have, a little safety sheet that describes to the worker with a graphic. Here's a picture of the antenna, and here are the red locations where it's hazardous. And so if there's a microwave dish that can cause a hazardous area on the antenna, the worker knows that from his tailgate talk before he climbs the tower. And he can see that, okay, I'll walk around, I'll climb on the other side of that. That kind of information is worth a lot. Now, some people say, well, I don't have that information because most sites do not have an RF safety program, but I have my personal alarm. If it's working properly, if you actually know how to use it right, that is the secondary safety factor, is to be able to say, okay, I've got my alarm. And I also use that instrument to tell me that, hey, someone's turned the power on. They're easy procedures, but they're not being implemented. Most tower climbers don't have personal monitors. It's a good thing. It's just not what you should depend on. What you should depend on first is knowing where the hazard areas are, and that should be done before you start climbing. In some cases, this means you're going to have to organize so that workers could, in fact, speak up and complain, whether it's the maintenance of the tower or having to work where towers, I'm going to be overexposed to standard, and yet not feel like they're alone, whether it's a union or a trade association or whatever else. The association can go to that licensee or can go to that tower owner or the site manager and say, hey, you got problems here, and you're not running this thing professionally. You're being paid to, because the licensees are paying lots of money for this stuff. There's plenty of money out there, but like you say, it gets divvied up to the contractors and subcontractors and subcontractors. But there's money to do it professionally, and that's the way it ought to be.
What's interesting is these carriers that hold these licenses are the ones that are never held accountable, but yet they're part of this system, essentially, that puts tower climbers in these situations. And I understand tower climbers need to know when to say no, and that is one of the most important things. Don't do it. But you have guys out there that have a wife and kids at home, and they don't want to complain to their company because, as we all know, a lot of the time the company retaliates and they might fire you, or you might get blacklisted from, I don't want to say from the industry, but you might get blacklisted from working for certain companies. But there's definitely retaliation involved with this type of stuff. And there's the other situations of working, and I'm working in a compound with 3 towers, and 50 feet from me at the same level, 200 feet up, is AT&T sector of antennas pointing directly at me. And the norm within the tower climbing industry is we don't communicate with anybody other than who we are working for at that time, which means you're just going to go up there and work, and you're not going to worry about any other antennas pointing at you. Should you? Yes, you should. But at the end of the day, that's not how tower climbers are being trained and taught out in the field. If you were to sit in a truck and have to call all of these companies and go through all this process to get all this stuff turned down, that could take hours and hours of time.
You bring up a couple of really good points. The one thing is, who has the liability? OSHA has no authority over the licensees. OSHA only has authority over employers. If you are a tower climber and you are working for some maintenance company, you have an employer. For example, you complain to the employer that, hey, I don't want to work there in front of those antennas, and the employer fires you. You do have the right to go to OSHA and say, okay, they took actions against me because I complained. It's a whistleblower law, and OSHA does have the authority to go after the employer. The issue of being blacklisted, that's probably real. It's hard to prove that you were blacklisted. All of a sudden you can't get work. But officially, OSHA can take direct action against employers who take negative actions against an employee who complained. The other thing that you mentioned in terms of the system, what fixes it is for the workers to know where the hazards are before they start climbing.
The carriers don't fall under the jurisdiction of OSHA, so how does all that work with reporting for a tower climber? Like, did they report these issues to the FCC? Would that be the route? How does that work?
Okay, so the point that what FCC does, they regulate the broadcasters, the people that have the license, and they can take a person's license away. That is their authority. OSHA has authority over employers. If you are an employee of a licensee, if you're a tower climber for AT&T, for example, then we can, if that employee, AT&T's employee, gets overexposed, then we can cite AT&T. The enforcement leverage is that threat of losing their license. And so it's much, much heavier enforcement than an OSHA citation, which is going to be a financial fine.
Going way back in time when they were set, they're separated into occupational exposures and public exposures. So occupational exposures allow more exposure per amount of tissue than the public ones. And how that's rationalized and justified is that if you are trained, if you have RF training, you know your exposure, and you can mitigate it to a degree. So you have to be both trained and in control of your exposure. You know that you are being exposed and you're taking proper procedures to reduce it as much as possible. But my question is, are people who are working in close proximity to those antennas, are they fully trained? Are they able to mitigate their exposure to the degree that's needed to protect themselves? When towers first went up, they were often on mountaintops, far away from people. There were not so many. Now we have this densification of infrastructure where there can be a lot of wireless facilities all in one place, especially in the urban environment, and you're not necessarily in control of all of the exposures that you could be getting, that you could be close to. So we've heard that there might be a tower, but then there might be a rooftop nearby that also has antennas on it. You might turn off the antennas that you are working on, but you can't turn off the other ones that are really close to you. And then, of course, what I've also heard is that antennas can turn back on, even when you have turned them off. And that is a real problem. So this idea that people who are workers who've been trained can be exposed to more doesn't really make sense with today's technology, the way it's designed, because you're not always in control of what you're being exposed to. The result of my investigation over all of these years is that the regulatory landscape in the United States is outmoded, completely outdated, and really deficient. It has not caught up with modern technologies, and there's so many gaps in regulations that there's just things that have fallen through the cracks. So there's not bioeffects research, which we used to have, including in the occupational realm. There's not oversight or accountability or enforcement, or it's minimal. In fact, it's basically the honor system, where companies are following voluntary guidelines and there's no oversight to ensure that things are getting done as they should. What we're seeing is safety being sacrificed for speed. Deployment is massive. There are deadlines that crews are trying to keep up with, and in the process, safety is not being prioritized as it needs to be. When have we seen such a rapid expansion of infrastructure?
If tower climbers reported these issues to insurance companies, the insurance companies or the carriers or the tower owners, would that have any effect on things at all?
Basically, leverage to make changes in our society can almost always be based on money. Insurance companies are an example of people who do have a vested interest in things being safe. If there's an accident, they end up paying money. They have inspectors who would go out much more often than an OSHA inspector to look at the people that their clients, the people that they are insuring, to make sure that those clients aren't being hazardous, aren't going to have excessive accidents that insurance companies going to have to pay for. It's probably hard for an individual tower climber to do, but an association can say, we know this particular company, maintenance company of towers or whatever, they got some bad actors there. They're not following up on maintaining their tower. They're not. They don't have RF safety programs where the workers can know where the hazard areas are. They won't power down when we're up there. You get that information to the insurance company that insures that company, maintenance contractor, for example, or the tower owner. It has an impact because they will contact the owner and say, you know what? We're not going to insure you anymore unless you pay us triple the premium and you fix these hazards so that you're at least following the law. Money does push changes. That's what makes the changes. Tower climbers are down at the bottom and taking on their own liability without knowing what the risks are and not knowing how to avoid those risks, prevent those risks.
And that's a huge issue nowadays too, is the misclassification of employees, tower workers with a pickup truck showing up at 6:30 every day to the office, but yet you're a 1099 worker. These companies are doing it all out of liability. One serious incident is going to shut that company down.
My response on that is if you're not going to obey the law, I mean, it's what you're describing, putting people on 1099 instead of a W-2, that's against the law. There's very specific requirements that say, no, you are just trying to avoid liability. You're telling them where to work. You're telling them what their job is today. They come to the office. You might as well just go steal money at this local 7-Eleven. You're a criminal. Mm-hmm. Your employer, white-collar criminal.
I agree.
And you can't consider yourself anything other than that. There are unions and associations who should be the voice. They need to understand that they're working for the workers as opposed to the licensees.
So in 2015, the Harvard Center for Ethics actually put out a report on the US FCC, and it was called Captured Agency. And they compared the tactics of the wireless industry to big tobacco. Some of the things they talked about is how there's a revolving door between industry and government in terms of the FCC commissioners. So you'll have, for example, someone who works for industry at the head of industry, who now is the head of the FCC, and then back after they retire. And we see this going on right now at the FCC. They talked about the public relations effort, which is well funded, the incredible amount of money going to Congress. They talked about the pressure to have minimal regulations so that industry could basically continue with, whatever its priorities are. I'm working on a paper right now, and I've found that, as expected, in the 10 years since that report was done, and by the way, in that report, you can see where they document not only the amount of money to Congress, but all of the FCC commissioners who prior worked for industry, and then after they retire, go on to work for industry and head up the wireless industry lobby firms. But now we have the same situation. So Ajit Pai, who used to be the chair of the FCC, is now the head of the CTIA, replacing a former FCC commissioner who had that position. This revolving door just goes on. And the problem is that it's like the wolf watching the hen house. We have industry-tied individuals who are in charge of the government agency that's supposed to be the watchdog for the wireless industry. The business model is you just go. You need to build out, you need to expand. It costs money, right? And there's time and effort that needs to be put into ensuring workplace safety and consumer safety. The report also talked about how research efforts were defunded, about the massive PR campaign about wireless safety that's been put out there. I should say this isn't about Democrat or Republican, because this regulatory capture has been going on over Democratic and Republican administrations, and it is a bipartisan affair. It's really about the undue influence of industry, especially when it comes to the telecommunications industry. There's so much money involved, billions of dollars, and the power of the industry is quite impressive. And so safety, it's just gone by the wayside in order to just plow forward. And having regulations is considered, it's an impediment to deployment in the fast way that industry wants to move. Another issue is that the medical community needs to be aware of this issue. They are not trained on RF exposure. There are not doctors who are taught in medical school about the impact, the symptoms, much less for climbers, that kind of high exposure. This is not what you're getting training in when you go to medical school, and that really needs to change. There should be doctors, or at least experts that cell tower climbers could go to who have overexposure to RF so they can be assessed and properly treated. That's another road that needs to be addressed. Right now, safety is not assured at any level. We have regulations which are outdated. We have a lack of worker protections. We have no oversight or enforcement, or minimal, the honor system, and there's not really an understanding by people about this issue. And I think we need to know this. I mean, if someone gets hurt on a tower, be it from RF exposure or from accidents, and this safety issue is ongoing, we should be putting pressure on both the government and the industry to let them know that, We want there to be safe conditions. We want this to be a safer technology. It's really, really important that consumers and the general public start thinking about this.
A lot of these certifications are not sufficient. They're not enough training, and a lot of the times are being faked. You know, I talked to an 18-year-old kid the other day who'd been climbing now for 5 months, and he told me he was working around antennas and it wasn't making him feel good. And you know, I started asking him some questions about his training. He said, I have all the certifications. My company got me all the certifications. And I said, okay. I said, well, you've done some RF training, right? And he said, no, I've never done any training. None. Not even rescue training, nothing. But yet he has these certifications that certain trade associations out there are endorsing that are able to be faked. Imagine if paramedics out there were just faking their license. The village I work for, they just pencil whipped my certification and now I'm a paramedic. You know, people would be dying left and right. And it's like these tower climbers, young kids getting put out there, no certifications, or maybe they have these certifications, but they never did the training. Some of these situations end up with these kids dying and nobody's held responsible but the people on the bottom. It's not the carrier that's holding the license on that tower. It's not the tower owner. A lot of the time, you know, it might not even be the company. It's the, you know, the individual. It's not right, because it could be better, because there is enough money out there to make this better for everyone. I really believe that. You just have all these people in the middle taking all these profits out.
Yeah, I would say that the liability threat is the one thing all these employers know. You know, it's so common, so much in OSHA. You have a hazardous operation, you contract it out so that you as an employer can feel like, okay, wash my hands of that hazard, because, hey, I gave it to a company. That company said they were trained and that they would do it safely. And I believe them. And hey, here's the certification, you know, that they gave me that says that they are good and certified climbers and that they will do it safely. And so now I'm the site manager. Great. I'm done worrying about that because I contracted that out to these other people. Now, this is where part of the problem is. A lot of the climbers don't work for another employer. They don't work for an employer. They become 1099 self-employed contractors, and so that liability does fall on them. The climber, he knows he's on a tower, and he hasn't. That certification he received was something that his boss just handed to him. That's really an egregious violation of, against the law, and it's something that his boss should go to jail for. And we have indeed done that to people who have given fake credentials to workers. It's something that, unfortunately, like that worker may not have known that he was required to be trained, and that the certification should be real. That young climber you're talking about, he may not have an idea of what that certification really means. It should mean. And when he finds out that's what it's supposed to mean, then it should be reported. And it probably won't, because he's worried about keeping his job.
If you had any advice that you could give to tower climbers out there being placed in unnecessarily dangerous situations, and I want to reiterate that because tower climbing, I don't think will ever be a safe job. I think it's always going to be dangerous, and we're never going to be able to make it totally safe. But on the other side of that, I think there's a lot of unnecessary risk, and I think that a lot of those risks could be mitigated if we just change some things around. But my question to you is, what advice would you give to them?
I would say, first of all, if you ever feel like something may not be safe, it's not something, for example, that you would want your daughter working or your son working there, then you've got to think, I shouldn't be working here either. So if you hear a climber or anybody say, well, you know, it's not dangerous. You know, I've been up there and I could feel heat. Well, he's been overexposed, and we don't know what kind of cognitive effects, his ability to think, his ability to remember. We don't know what kind of effects may be there. That's what the purpose of the standard is, to protect against. And everybody in the industry, so every CEO of every carrier will say, you bet, we make sure workers do not get exposed above that. And if you're a worker that allowed yourself to be exposed above that, You're being dumb, and you're being unfair to the other workers around, and you're being unfair to your family and yourself.
RF exposure isn't just another workplace hazard. It's an invisible danger that the industry has downplayed for far too long. And climbers need to hold themselves to a higher standard. We need to demand more training, better training. We need to demand that this equipment stays off when we're working in front of it and around it. And we need to ask that the accountability be placed on the people actually running these sites, not the tower climbers out there just doing their jobs. In 2023, while representing tower climbers through the CWA, I sat in a meeting with the CEO of the second largest tower company in the world. Alongside another climber, we shared a first-hand account. A crew had been working on a cell tower that was near an AM broadcast tower when they suddenly became sick. They didn't have the authority to shut the tower down, and the exposure forced them off-site. Yet when we raised these concerns to the top executives, the CEO's response was simple: not our problem. Get a hold of the carrier. That's where climbers are left, caught between carriers, tower owners, and regulators. They're told to take personal responsibility, but without proper training and control over the risks, that's impossible. Speaking out risks retaliation, and staying silent risks their health. So whose problem is it? Because right now, it's only the climbers paying the price.